In 2001, the XFL began and was canceled not so long after starting. The league only lasted 1 year, but with so much financial backing and so much promotion going into the league, why did the XFL fail? Let's get into it. What is up, everybody? Jacob Ochocinco here with Amateur Hour Sports, talking about the XFL and why it failed the first time. I know it has since been recreated, canceled with no plans to continue in the next season. But in 2001, the XFL had one season, and with such a bright start, it failed so miserably. I'm going to take you through all the steps and the story as to why the XFL failed when it had so much potential. If it is your first time here with me at Amateur Hour Sports and you like what you see, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. So Vince McMahon, the CEO and executive of the WWE, yes, he had this idea about creating a rival football league to the NFL because in this time, there were a lot of people who were complaining about the state of the NFL, how it had gotten too soft, there were too many rules protecting the players. They wanted a little bit more violent action involved in football, and they weren't getting that within the NFL. So they sought after creating this XFL. McMahon, like I said, the chairman and CEO of the WWE, but when it was the WWF, he was one of the main factors as a promoter in causing the surge in popularity of pro wrestling. It is clear that he has the potential to market something like an XFL with some success. And McMahon wasn't the only one in thinking that the NFL had gone soft. One of those who also thought this was the NBC Sports chairman, Dick Ebersol. And when McMahon proposed this idea of a rivaling football league with much less protection on the players, much more action, he proposed this idea to Dick Ebersol. And since McMahon and Ebersol had been business partners in the past, it was a match made in heaven. Ebersol was all over the idea, and thus the formation of the XFL began. These two, like I said, had been partners before and were so comfortable working with each other that Dick Ebersol told his wife that should he ever pass, he would like Vince McMahon to be the legal guardian of his 3 children. With so much financial backing and 2 very innovative personalities. I mean, the chairman of NBC Sports and the main reason that the WWE is at its level of popularity that it is in Vince McMahon. These two together, who have a great working relationship, there was so much potential for the XFL. McMahon had already conquered the pro wrestling world, and now he wanted a new challenge. He wanted to conquer pro football. But he wanted to change football like he changed wrestling. He wanted to add in more personality and more angles into the football games to make it a little bit more exciting. Even if these were manufactured angles and rivalries, that would just help make it a little bit more exciting, similar to the way he does it with WWE. A lot of the fake rivalries, a lot of the fake fights, these sorts of things make it a lot more entertaining for the average fan. So he wanted to introduce this into the pro football world. Vince McMahon said that every single XFL game was going to feel like an episode of Survivor, with so much drama going on, so much entertainment. Contrasting the NFL's model of having franchises, each team is its own franchise with its own owner. The XFL owned all 8 teams, meaning McMahon and Ebersol owned every single team in the league. The league was owned 50-50 by the WWF and NBC Sports. McMahon, again, tired of how soft football had become, wanted to make an extreme football league, promoting more violence. Hence the name XFL, standing for Extreme Football League. In order to do this, some real changes were imposed. Instead of a generic coin toss, there was what was known as a scramble. The football was placed in the middle of the field, and players on opposing teams would race to the middle, and the first to secure that football in the middle won either kicking or receiving for his team. The coin toss has turned into a bit of a formality, but he wanted more excitement at any point in the game, so adding in this scramble would make it more exciting. But the only problem was, before a first game of the season for 2 teams, there was a player who was injured in the scramble as he separated his shoulder. Thus, ending his entire season in order to recover. The XFL also eliminated the fair catch rule on punts, so any sort of receiver who was catching a ball with incoming players had no way of protecting himself and was just prone to being absolutely fucking lit up. Defensive backs were also allowed to make as much contact as they wanted on receivers who were trying to make their routes to get open for the football. This made the passing game utterly impossible as the receivers could never get open. The NFL has a strict 5-yard rule where you're allowed to touch the player within 5 yards, but after they run 5 yards, you can't touch them at all until they come in contact with the football. After realizing the many issues with McMahon's new rules, the XFL was continuously changing the rules for their game during the season. The league was only about 2 things. The first one was violence. The names of teams were used to promote violence. There was the Rage, the Enforcers, the Demons, the Hitmen, among other names. Players were allowed to put anything on the back of their jerseys to promote any sort of rivalry or any sort of violence just to make it a little bit more entertaining. Players were mic'd up on the field so that you could hear the thunderous sounds of bodies colliding in any sort of action. Some cameramen were armored up to sprint onto the field to get close-ups of the action without getting hurt. And like I said, this league was about 2 things. The first one was violence, and the second thing was sex. Before the league even started, the team websites always had streams of their cheerleaders. In all of the team's media kits, there were numerous pages taken out devoted to the cheerleaders, listing off their descriptions, which would usually have a list of their tattoos and piercings. During games, there were hot tubs set up at each end of the field that strippers would just lounge in throughout the duration of the game. These strippers would not always have clothes on. But enough about all that. I've talked about everything in this league except for the actual football. This was big for some players. The XFL provided a second chance for some players falling into a bit of obscurity, those who hadn't quite gotten to the NFL but still wanted to make a push in their career, a potential to play pro football, and this provided them that chance to play in front of millions of people for money. The XFL had to find its own talent and did not take players from the NFL to come play. Just anybody who wasn't in the NFL. The first games of the season were set to be played February 3rd, 2001. The training camps for all 8 teams began January 2nd, 2001. Yes, teams only had 32 days in training camp to get to know each other, to get used to the new rules for the XFL, and it's just hard to pick up playing at a professional level of any sport right before a season starts. You need an extensive period of time to tinker your game perfectly for the season, but only 32 days were given. Maybe you can guess how this all went. They wanted to start the XFL regular season right at the conclusion of the NFL season so that the lingering desire for football would still be present. So as soon as the Super Bowl ends, there's more pro football in the XFL. The XFL, like many other rivaling pro sports leagues in the past, decided to use a different colored ball for their games. Rather than the simple leather ball that the NFL uses, they decided to make theirs black and red. It's kind of like how the ABA, the American Basketball Association of the early 70s, used a red, white, and blue basketball, contrary to the regular leather ball that the NBA used. And the NBA, to this day, uses the red, white, and blue money ball in their 3-point contest. So the XFL, taking a bit of inspiration from that, uses the black and red ball. The problem was, if there was any sort of moisture on that football, the black dye would start to run. Not only would it get black dye on people's hands and jerseys, it also made the ball very slippery. And I'm not talking about moisture as in anytime it rained. Literally, if it was humid outside, the black dye would run and would grease up the football to the point where it was virtually impossible to throw and catch, making the passing game even more seldom seen. Midway through the season, the brains in charge of the XFL figured out if they sanded the football with sandpaper before the game, the black dye wouldn't run and you could throw the ball and catch the ball without any sort of slippage. But why didn't they just change the color of the football? So instead, they sanded down all the balls before the game started. In another funny story before the season started, on January 9th, under a month before the XFL season was going to start, a blimp carrying heavy XFL promotion crashed, causing $2.5 million in damage. If that is not foreshadowing for what is to come, I don't know what is. Finally, the game started, and the first game week was a huge success. 16 million people watched the broadcast, and ratings were very high. At the opening night, the beer in the stadium sold out within the first quarter. Fans were flooding the gates trying to get in to watch XFL games. The TV ratings actually topped World Series ratings for 2001. An absolute blockbuster first night for the XFL. But as time wore on, viewers looked past the bright lights, the cheerleaders, the fog machines, and saw the XFL for what it really was. Terrible football. Just fucking terrible. There was no time to prepare for the season, the rules were shit and were always changing throughout the year. 1 week later, viewership halved, and within the NBC, alarm bells started to ring. Halfway through the season, there was an absolute free fall in ratings and viewership. But the XFL and NBC were committed to not only finishing that first season, but to finishing a second season. But viewership was falling, and fans who saw the state of the football being played were not going to be conned into coming back and watching more XFL. It was inevitable that the XFL was going to fail at this point, but people were too proud to admit it. 8 weeks into the 12-week season, the XFL broke the record for lowest rated primetime broadcast, with only 2.2 million viewers and a 1.6 rating, contrasting the 16 million viewers on day 1 and 10.3 rating. In the last 2 weeks of the season, many players started to abandon ship. In fact, some players managed to get NFL contracts out of this whole ordeal. The only XFL MVP in history, quarterback Tommy Maddox, got a contract with the Pittsburgh Steelers, where he was the starting QB for a while before Ben Roethlisberger took over. So if there's ever a trivia night and one of the questions is, who was the quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers before Ben Roethlisberger? You've got the answer. XFL MVP Tommy Maddox. In fact, at Super Bowl 40, when the Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Seattle Seahawks, Tommy Maddox was on the roster and therefore has a Super Bowl ring. Finally, the season ended and it was time to acknowledge that the XFL was just simply not going to work. But Vince McMahon had a contract with the NBC saying that they had to pay $50 million a year for the XFL to run. So if Vince McMahon wanted to, and he could have legally done so, he could have had another season and collected the big paycheck from NBC Sports. But because of his great relationship with Dick Ebersol, he showed mercy to him and decided to just shut down the league entirely. 2 months after it had begun, it was no more. But it wasn't all a failure. Like I said, there were many players who ended up getting NFL contracts out of playing in the XFL. The XFL actually also introduced the Skycam. It is the camera over the field to give you better angles and better broadcast of the game and certain replays to see different aspects of the game. Also, they introduced miking up the players so that you could hear the impact of the collisions on the field. And also, they introduced cameras in the locker room to show the mood before and after the game. All three of these things are utilized by the NFL even today, but they weren't at the time. They were innovative. They were created by the XFL. Truthfully, the XFL had potential to work, but the football was just so bad. And it is the reason behind their failure. The most often reason cited for its failure is because of the quality of the football. Mismanagement led to most of these problems. The rules were constantly being changed. Teams weren't given enough time in preseason to prepare for the regular season. The balls were too slippery to throw and catch. Mismanagement ultimately led to the failure of the XFL, like many other sporting ventures in the past. The broadcasting experience was way ahead of its time, but the football quality was way behind its time. But with this potential for success with the XFL lingering, McMahon rebooted the XFL for a 2020 season, 19 years after its original. And there was some decent success. McMahon owns 100% of the league instead of this 50-50 BS from 2001. And the league would have been successful for its first season, but for the sporting world being halted. Because the league wasn't established and wasn't having enough revenue at the time, they had to lay off almost all of the employees in the XFL. The league went bankrupt and they no longer have any plans for a 2021 season. But the league was starting to see success in its rebooted form. But we shall wait and see if the XFL ever tries again, trying to capitalize on that potential success, attempting to learn from their mistakes of the past, because now we know there were a lot of them. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like the video if you like, and subscribe to Amateur Hour Sports for more content just like this as well. Hit that notification bell because we post 4 times a week. We talk about basketball, we talk about football, we talk about soccer, insight and opinion on the sporting world, as well as some videos like this, informative videos on the history of sport. Make sure you are subscribed to Amateur Hour Sports. At the end of the day, I believe what I say, and if you disagree, that's okay. We'll see you again next time.